going inside the issues of our community. This is Local 12 Newsmakers.
The people of the world can live together in peace. We know that is God's vision. Now that must be our work here on earth.
On June the 4th, President Obama delivered a major speech at Cairo University on the relationship of Muslim, Christian, and Jewish people around the world, especially in the Middle East. The implications of that speech are still only beginning to be understood. Good morning and welcome to Local 12 Newsmakers. President Obama's speech in Cairo 6 weeks ago, like so many of his steps in the last 6 months, struck a new tone and promised a different set of policies. After the president's speech, I was joined by Dabdoub, the executive director of the Council of American Islamic Relations, here on Newsmakers to discuss what she had heard in the speech. This morning I'm joined by Jaffee, the director of the Jewish Community Relations Council, JCRC. Before assuming that position, Mr. Jaffee worked with the American Israel Public Affairs Committee in Washington, D.C. Brian, welcome back to Newsmakers.
Thanks so much for having me.
You know, we've had a little bit of time now to listen to the speech, reread it, read it carefully. What did you hear and what do you think of it at this point?
I thought it was a remarkable speech. I think you kind of said it right in your intro. Really, whether the speech was a success or not, well, we can ultimately judge that by what happens in the next 4 years or 8 years or beyond. But I think that, as you said, President Obama did an excellent job of beginning a new conversation between our country and the Muslim world. He did it using their reference points, speaking in their language, which to some of his critics seemed fawning, but it seems to be working. I think we have to acknowledge that whether or not you lay this at the feet of the Bush administration, the last 8 years weren't really working for us in terms of our reputation in the Middle East. And since the speech, our reputation's improving. So hopefully that can lead to things that we can build upon to really move forward towards Middle East peace.
Do you think and I know you speak with and are in communication with people in Israel, do you think the way that American Jewish community heard this speech and the Israeli nation heard this speech, Jewish community in Israel, how might this have been different, and what is there anything to learn there?
Sure. In both countries and in both communities, there's no one reaction to the speech. Right. I mean, there's a range of reactions. Some Jewish organizations and individual Jewish leaders are very enthusiastic. Some were very concerned by a lot of what was said in the speech. I myself am somewhat divided. On the one hand, I really admire the new tone that the president set, and he said some remarkably difficult things given his audience. I mean, he spoke.
For example, what would be a difficult thing?
He spoke very forcefully about Holocaust denial. He referred to Holocaust denial as baseless and ignorant and hateful in a country that has a big problem with Holocaust denial. That wasn't easy to do. When he was talking about Arab-Israeli peacemaking, it was easy for him to focus on Israel's obligations, which he did, but he also said that the Arab nations have a lot more that they should be doing. I mean, he praised the Arab Peace Initiative on the one hand, but he said that was a beginning and not an end, and Arab nations have a lot that they can do to play a more helpful role in finding peace between Israelis and Palestinians. And of course, finally, the most, I think, difficult thing for him was to state very unequivocally that our country's bond with Israel is unbreakable. That was not an applause line in that crowd, but it's an important American value and principle, and he stated it clearly.
Let's listen to a bit of his presentation, one little section, because I think it's one of those sections where he sets a tone that's a little different, not just from President Bush, but from earlier presidents as well.
But if we see this conflict only from one side or the other, then we will be blind to the truth. The only resolution is for the aspirations of both sides to be met through two states where Israelis and Palestinians each live in peace and security. That is in Israel's interest, Palestine's interest, America's interest, and the world's interest. And that is why I intend to personally pursue this outcome with all the patience and dedication that the task requires.
that theme of patience, past presidents, and not just President Bush, had a tendency to say, we're going to get a resolution to this by the end of, and then you name a year. And it seems to me those are fraught with difficulties with such a complex situation. Did that passage strike you as important?
Important, yes, and I think full of both hope and anxiety for me. You know, on the one hand, it's somewhat breathtaking that this president, with everything that we're up against, the economic crisis, challenges in Iran and Afghanistan, Iraq, new challenges in Pakistan, he's made peace between Israelis and Palestinians, you know, one of his primary objectives, where so many have failed in the past. And of course, America has an important role to be engaged as a mediator in that conflict. What was a bit troubling for me, and not in that quote, there's nothing about that quote, but in other passages of the speech was what seemed like, well, there are a couple things. First of all, when referring to Israel's creation, I think the president, I hope unintentionally, made a rather difficult linkage between the tragic history of persecution of Jews, especially in the Holocaust, and the creation of Israel. He said nothing about, you know, the thousands of years of connection that Jews have to the land of Israel, the enormous amount of progress and building that Jews have done in the land of Israel for millennia, including the decades even before the Holocaust happened. You know, it was as if, you know, Israel was created because the Holocaust happened, and that was something that was very, very troubling for many Jews to hear. Second, you know, yes, it's true that both sides have had suffering and pain. Both sides have obligations to make peace, but many passages of the speech struck of a difficult moral equivalence. You know, the Jews suffered, and now the Palestinians are suffering at the hands of the Israelis. There's no question that Palestinians, you know, have a difficult life, but there was nothing in his speech about, you know, any of the history of Palestinian rejection of offers of compromise or a willingness to come to the table and make concessions of their own. That's been a really difficult and problematic dynamic in the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and that was given rather short shrift by the president. You
know, and basically, I guess it was within 10 days of the president's speech, Prime Minister Netanyahu gave a major address. Right. And part of that, and it dealt with a lot of these themes that you talked about the importance in the region of economic development as a way, and actually that passage in his speech struck me as the way we talk in metropolitan Cincinnati about how do we get past all these fragmented governments. Well, we focus on things that we have in common, economic development. But there was that. What did you think of the Prime Minister's speech? And it wasn't a response to the president, but it had to be read in light of that.
Of course. I mean, he intended to give the speech not as a response to the Cairo speech, but rather as the culmination of his first 100 days in office and his assessment of what's happening in the region. And I think that the Prime Minister's speech and the Arab and Palestinian response to the speech is kind of a microcosm of some of these problematic dynamics, namely an Israeli gesture of compromise met by Arab and Palestinian rejection. Israel's willingness to compromise predates the Netanyahu speech. It goes back as old as the state of Israel itself. Israel's withdrawn from territory when there's been a real partner on the other side, in Egypt and Jordan, in the context of peace agreements. Israel's also withdrawn from territory unilaterally when it's had to, when there hasn't been a partner with whom they could reasonably negotiate. And unfortunately, the response each time has been a continual refusal of a right to exist as a Jewish state for Israel, and a demand for further concessions. So what Prime Minister Netanyahu did was three things. First, he said, I'm ready to travel anywhere to meet with anyone without preconditions. I'll go to Damascus, Beirut, Riyadh, I'll talk to anyone, and we can talk peace. He recommitted the government of Israel to a two-state solution. He laid out some important principles for peacemaking. He said that he endorsed the creation of an independent Palestinian state as long as it met two criteria: recognition of Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state, and that it be demilitarized. And neither of those prerequisites, by the way, are anything new. Since the beginning of the Oslo peace process more than 15 years ago, Arab and Palestinian and Israeli and American negotiators have been talking about a demilitarized Palestinian state.
I want to make sure, this is the passage that actually struck me in this speech. And I know it's not new, but I just want people to be, got it so we can see it on screen.
Right.
This is from Netanyahu's speech on June the 14th. He said, "What is necessary for our security," speaking of Israel, "that in any peace agreement, the Palestinian area must be demilitarized. No army, no control of airspace, real effective measures to prevent arms coming in." Now, yes, that's been there. I guess I hadn't focused on it so clearly until I read this speech. If you're talking about two states, how does one state dictate that to another state? To say, especially two groups of people who have been in military conflict, you say one of the conditions is, yes, we'll recognize the second state, but you can't have an army. You can't control your airspace.
As an American and as an American supporter of Israel, I think it's fair for Israeli leaders to ask, well, what kind of Palestinian state are we talking about? And again, when you look at the track record of just the enormous amount of terrorism and violence that's emanated from the Palestinian territories, you look at what happened to Gaza after Israel made enormous concessions by withdrawing every single settler and soldier from the Gaza Strip 4 years ago, and for the sake of making Gaza a test ground for Palestinian independence and autonomy, it immediately became a base of terrorist operations. There was immediately a wave of suicide bombings and rocket attacks against Israelis. Hamas, the terrorist organization, set up shop there, and they executed a violent coup against their own Palestinian government 2 summers ago. And now they rule Gaza with an iron fist, and they dragged Gazans into a terribly destructive conflict with Israel 6 months ago. So yes, Netanyahu was skeptical in his early days as prime minister about committing to a two-state solution until there could be some kind of sense about what this state would look like. This would not be the first time there was a demilitarized state. There are more than a dozen countries that belong to the United Nations that don't have an army. What the Israelis are saying is, yes, there should be an independent Palestinian state.
How many of those, though, are sitting next to a neighbor who they would have had this kind of military conflict with?
Well, but this is precisely the point. The Israelis are saying you should have every single power that a sovereign state has, except for the power to harm our security and to make war against us. Let me ask a different question. Why would a state of Palestine need rockets and armies and bombs? They should have security services. They should have police forces to maintain law and order. But it's fair to ask in these fraught times, why is there a focus on a Palestinian army?
Couldn't we say that same thing, not geographically, but the president was just in Russia, and we were talking about nuclear weapons and missiles and the numbers. Why do nations need to arm themselves like this? I mean, yes, on one theoretical, but the point is, nations do that.
Right.
It's part of the nation-state model.
But we're not starting with a blank page. If the state of Palestine were created tomorrow, we couldn't pretend that that history began on that day. There's a very, very difficult history of threats emanating from the Palestinian territories. And let's move beyond that for a moment to the part of Netanyahu's speech that I think maybe both struck us. What he said was, if we can get past what is really the root of the conflict, which is Arab and Palestinian refusal of Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state, there are enormous opportunities for Arabs and Israelis, for Israel and Palestine to work together to share in the extraordinary resources of the Middle East, the economic progress and technological innovation that the region should be known for. It's more than just oil in the Middle East. I mean, they can do amazing things with water desalinization and solar energy and green technology, medical research. There's great human capital in Israel and in the Arab countries. And so, going back to the words of President Obama, it's time for the Palestinians to focus on what they can build, not what they can destroy.
I want to listen to one more little clip from the president's speech in Cairo, and then we'll move on to one other thing.
Sure.
So.
This construction violates previous agreements and undermines efforts to achieve peace. It is time for these settlements to stop.
And I think the Palestinians would go even further and say that the settlements need to come to an end. I don't know that that's ever going to happen, but.
That's the president and Dabdoub, who was on the show about a month ago. Okay. This issue of the settlements, it's been threaded through the discussions for decades now. Are we any place different on this? Did the president say anything new? did Netanyahu say anything new about the settlement question?
The Prime Minister the Prime Minister of Israel committed his country to working with the United States and with legitimate Palestinian partners to deal with the settlement issue. For now, that could certainly mean, and he committed to not building out, further into land that could become part of a Palestinian state. And to the extent that the United States and Israel still disagree on some aspects of settlement policy, they're working through that as two allies should. And I think the president, despite some initial focus on settlements that seemed a bit disproportionate, I think that the administration's done a very good job of working through these issues and these disagreements quietly and without rancor and without ultimatums. But again, let's not forget the track record. Israel has withdrawn settlements. Israel withdrew from the entire Gaza Strip, every single inch of it. 8,000 individuals. Families were uprooted from their homes. Bodies were taken out of cemeteries so that, again, Gaza could become this test ground. And Israel didn't get a good response. When you look at the response to Netanyahu's speech, that is a troubling indication about whether or not we're going to see anything new. Despite everything that went into the speech, the initial Palestinian response was that the speech was worthless. Even moderates in the Palestinian Authority said that Netanyahu would have to wait 1,000 years for a Palestinian who would work with Netanyahu on the basis of those statements. Even the president of Egypt, with whom Israel has a peace treaty, said that Netanyahu's insistence on recognition of a Jewish state torpedoed the chances for peace. So what that told Israelis about the prospect of making further concessions or the whole settlement issue is that it's very possible that no amount of territorial concessions is going to be enough to satisfy Israel's neighbors. That the only thing that Israel has the power to do to end the Arab-Israeli conflict is to commit national suicide, to cease being a Jewish state. And that's understandably a red line for them.
I know I'm going over, but in terms of time, but it's okay. And
I'm trying to be concise.
Oh, no, you're fine. There's just too much to talk about, that's all. In doing some research to get ready for this, on Thursday I ran into a story I found on the web in which Netanyahu's father said that, and I quote, referring to his son, he told me they would never meet any one of those conditions, sort of saying, don't worry about what my son said, it isn't going to happen. Is that where we really are here, though?
I saw that report too. I'm not sure what the conversation in the family was. What I know is what the Prime Minister of Israel said on behalf of his government, and he can be held accountable to those words. The democratic nation of Israel can be held accountable, and that's one of the crucial differences between Israel and its neighbors. Israel is a country that is a democracy. It respects the rule of law, and if Israel makes commitments, they'll live up to them, and they should live up to them. There's a range of opinions in Israeli society about conflict and conflict resolution, but ultimately, if Israel is met by a peace partner that's willing to come to the table and also offer concessions and really offer peace, then the Israelis will live up to their obligations.
Brian, thank you for being here. Thank you for being so frank. I really appreciate it. And we'll have you back because it's good discussion and it's good insight into what's going on in an absolutely critical part of the world.
Appreciate that, Dan. Thank you.
Stay tuned. After the break, an opportunity to explore an often overlooked part of our region. We may think that the place we live as an urban suburban metropolis, but in fact, beautiful farmland is minutes from the center cities of Cincinnati, Covington, and Newport. And at a time when the movement is to local, eating fresh, the Campbell County Backroads Farm Tour this coming Saturday is an invitation to all of us to get in touch with our rural side. Welcome back. About 3 weeks ago, I was asked to meet with a producer from the British Broadcasting Company who was touring the United States. We talked about local television news, but as a native of Edinburgh who now lives in London, she asked if I could show her any farmland. Within 15 minutes, we were in rural Campbell County, far away from the skyscrapers and in the midst of lush Kentucky farms set in a rolling landscape. This Saturday, everyone is invited to explore the back roads of Campbell County and meet local farmers. To talk about this this tour, I am joined by three really special people. Don Sorrell, the Campbell County Extension Agent for Agriculture and Natural Resources, along with Hannah Meyers, who's 13 years old, and her brother Michah Meyers, and their goat, Royce. And yeah, there we go. There we got a full shot of all four guests. Now, we only have microphones on three of you. We can't interview the goat, but welcome to Newsmakers. So, Don, this is your life, helping farmers and helping people understand about farms. You know, what is the purpose of this tour on Saturday?
The main purpose of the tour is to invite the public to come out and experience the farm life and to reconnect to the farm so they can see that agriculture is still important in our communities and begin to get a sense of the reality of where their food comes from. We've gotten 2 or 3 generations away from the farm, and we want to make that reconnection.
Yeah, I don't know if reconnection for most individuals is even the reality. It's a connection. People are really out of touch with this. Hannah, you live on a farm.
Yes.
You're around fields and animals all the time. What is it that you would think you would want to tell people? What would be the most important thing you would want to tell somebody who lives in a city, in a suburb, who never sees this kind of animal?
Well, just being able to be outside, you know, where grass is instead of concrete, and being able to see like an open sky, it's really cool.
Yeah. And do you, what about the work side of it? Do you have lots of work to do?
Well, it is hard work, but you know that it's all part of it. So it just kind of goes along with living on a farm.
Okay. Michah, you have lots of goats on your farm, and is Royce just one of them?
Yeah.
And does this goat ever get inside? Is this like a dog? Is this like a cat? Do you have a personal relationship with the goat?
Well, yeah, a little.
Do you?
But it doesn't come inside.
It doesn't come inside? For obvious reasons. Mm-hmm. It's not house trained, which I'm very worried about at this moment. But I understand you were telling me just before that other animals do come in your house, right?
Yes, our miniature horses have been in our house before.
And when you say miniature, what are we talking about?
They're just like big horses, except they're just like this tall.
Okay.
And you can't ride them, but you drive them, and they're really fun.
Don, how important is agriculture in a place like Campbell County? And you know, people may know Newport, they may know Fort Thomas and some of the suburban growth, but how important is agriculture still in our community?
Well, about half of the farm or the land in Campbell County is still held by individual landowners, and most of those are farmers. We have about 1,600 parcels of land, of which only about 500 total farms. So it still is a vibrant part of our area, but we still need to make that reconnection in many cases back to the community. Now, this is an attempt for us to do that.
Does your family farm grow things that you then sell at farmers markets or anything?
No, we just have, us kids have market animals, and we go through 4-H with them, and we raise them from little babies, I guess, and then at the end of the year, we'll show them at the fair and sell them.
Now, this whole, and I referenced this earlier, there's this whole movement now to buy locally, eat locally. That's really still possible here, right? There are farmers in Campbell County who are growing fruits, vegetables that they're getting to farmers markets?
Yes, we've actually got 3 farmers market locations in the county, Tuesday, Friday, and Saturday locations, so folks can actually go there and buy their produce, or they can make that connection back to the farms. In fact, 2 of the locations we have on tour, you can actually buy your produce right there.
And how many locations are on the tour?
We have 16 individual stops. We encourage you to come out and enjoy those. You won't be able to see all 16, I don't think, in one day.
You have to select.
But you can pick and choose those that you think you would like, and it's important to get that brochure, which is at the Campbell County Libraries.
We're going to talk about that in a minute, how people get in touch with this. Is your farm on this tour?
Yes.
And are you going to invite people? Are you going to be ready to talk to people?
Uh-huh.
Is this pretty exciting?
Yeah.
Yeah? Hi, Mike. Let's make sure that people know about this. If you want to learn about the details of the Campbell County Farm Tours this Saturday, you can call the Campbell County Conservation District offices at 859-635-9587, or check out the website at http, there we go, with the slashes and all that, home.fuse.net/Campbell CD. So, and there's, in addition to that, there are brochures and maps at a whole bunch of different areas, public libraries, Remke markets throughout northern Kentucky, United Dairy Farmers in Wilder, and lots of other places. So, you know, this is a great opportunity, and it's really wonderful that you got, and Rolls-Royce has done great, and I think we have made it through this. So thank you for being there. Okay. And thank you for making Newsmakers a part of your Sunday morning. Join us again next week to meet the men and the women, whatever their age, shaping our community for the future. Have a good week.